Hi, yes, this is our audience. I'm Jennell Jaquays. I'll do a quick introduction here. I was one of the team that developed Quake 2 at id Software. Let's see here. Enter. This is about making Quake 2 in general, kind of a discussion of the topic, discussion of the people who were there, discussion of my involvement, my relationship with some of those people, and how we did the game at the time. I was a level designer on Quake 2, Quake 3, and Quake 3 Team Arena, and I left during the development of Doom 3. Really quick background about me for people who don't know me from Eve. I began making board games as a child. My brother and I used to make them. I still have some of them. Graduated with a fine art degree from college. I have a BA, not a BFA, but a BA in fine art. Published a D&D fan magazine while I was in school. That's where I got my start. That's kind of where I got my first fame. I was an adventure designer artist for Judges Guild working on Dungeons & Dragons adventures. I moved on from there, eventually a little bit freelancing, and then I ended up at Coleco working on toys and games for a toy company. That turned into eventually being the director of game design for the ColecoVision. So anything that came out from Coleco for the ColecoVision and the Atom that was a game, I worked on, or my team worked on. I was an illustrator and graphic designer. I eventually ended up at TSR as a book paint, the people who were publishing Dungeons & Dragons at the time, before Wizards of the Coast. I was a book cover illustrator and eventually a part-time, was director of graphics for a while there. I ended up moving from there to id Software, from id Software to Microsoft, Microsoft to CCP, the people who do Eve Online. Followed that up by leaving CCP under my own power and became a co-founder and creative director for a small company called Old School. Now I work with my own design firm, it's me, called Dragon Girl Studios, and I do mostly tabletop right now. This is just an example of some of my early cover paintings that I did. These were all for TSR. This one was never published. And so how does a book cover painter for a failing RPG publisher join a team of young computer game rock stars? Well, when I was at Coleco, there was a designer, roughly a peer of mine, who I tried to bring into the company. All my designers were either current or ex role-playing game developers. One of those I attempted to hire was Sandy Peterson. This was around 1984, 83, 84. Well, Sandy wisely refused my offer. He didn't like my boss, and within a year we were collapsing anyway. But go ahead, 12 years, and I happened to meet Sandy at a tabletop game convention, and he took that opportunity to sell me on coming to interview with id Software. I hadn't even really heard of them. I sort of knew of Doom. I had never heard of Quake. I've never played Quake. I think I played Wolfenstein 3D a couple times on my Macintosh. So I was not your traditional level designer going for wanting to work at this fantastic game company. You know, this was not my dream job. This was an opportunity, but I'd never heard of these guys. So Sandy asked me, because I used to make game worlds for Dungeons & Dragons, theater of the mind play, not computer games. And that's how I started my career, was making game adventures. And there's 3 of them that I had published back in the 1970s. And all 3 of them are still in print, 40 years later. So my job started at id started with a week-long interview, where I learned in a week how to use the Quake editing tools. This isn't one of mine. I grabbed this off the internet. I can't find my folder of disks that has everything I worked on. If you've probably heard any of the other older developers discuss, they talk about stuff stored in storage units. That's kind of where my stuff is right now. I'm still hunting for it after a move. So I worked on learning how to use this 3D development tool. I was very interested in the idea of making dungeons in 3D, but the idea of learning how to do essentially CAD work in a computer was something new for me. But by the end of the week, I had actually produced one game level, and some pieces of that did end up not in Quake 2 itself, but in City 64, which was a 64-player map we released later. It's kind of a barrel-shaped room that you wade through to get to some secret stuff. It may have actually made it into Quake 2. I have not played it in so long that I don't remember if it is. It would have been on the second city level or the upper city level. So despite never having played Doom or Quake before the interview, despite never having built an interactive game setting with hands-on tools, it asked me to join the team. And 3 weeks later, I left Wisconsin and moved to Texas, where I joined a team of rock stars. And this is the team as it was the summer after, I think it was the summer we were actually working on Quake 2, because this appeared in a computer gaming magazine, or PC Gamer magazine. And we are on top of that black building that you saw in the previous picture. This is the top of our offices at 18601 LBJ Freeway, Mesquite, Texas. So what was this team? What did this team look like when I started there? There was John Carmack. Everyone knows he's the famous name of the game company. Adrian Carmack, the artist, no relation. Kevin Cloud, one of the other artists who ended up being the project manager on Doom 2, or on Quake 2. Those were our three owners. Then there was Sandy Peterson, a level designer, American McGee, and these are all mostly contemporary to when I worked with them, the photos. So this is what the team looked like. American McGee, level designer. John Cash was the gameplay programmer. Paul Steed, our artist. Michael Abrash, part of the programming team. Christian Antko was, he joined, I believe, as community management. And he was working on the Quake World setting we had out there for users. I don't remember, it's kind of vague to me. But he ended up becoming a level designer. Tim Willits, one of the level designers, and then the business people, Todd Hollinshead, who was fairly new. I credit Todd for its success during this time period. Miss Donna, one of the rare photos of Miss Donna. Best way to describe Miss Donna, if you've never met her, is if you've ever watched the Beverly Hillbillies. Think of Ellie Mae, all grown up, and will not tolerate your shit. Pardon my French. And then Barrett Alexander, who was our biz guy too. Now, within a few weeks and a few months, this team changed. Michael Abrash left. He was already going to be leaving. I only crossed with him 2 weeks. I think I met him once in the office, which is about as many times as I actually talked with John Carmack during my 5 years there. And then Sandy Peterson left. I discovered later, Sandy's unclear about this, but I remember when Sandy left, he left to go to Ensemble Studios, another Dallas game company. When he invited me to come down, he invited me saying I was going to be replacing John Romero as a level designer. What Sandy didn't reveal to me is that I was going to be replacing him as a level designer. And he shared this with me a few years later when I went to work with him at Ensemble Studios. So the team changed fairly quickly. But we then grew. We added another programmer, Brian Hook. And then he was kind of a young Turk back then. He actually apologized to me years later, took me out to lunch, and he apologized for what he felt was being a jerk his first few weeks at id Software. And I really appreciated that, him saying that. And then Brandon James, who was a young guy we hired. He had worked at like a online gaming center where he helped people play 3D games online. He would teach them how to play shooters. And the way he would do that is he named his character Kill Me. And then he would run around, and that was the point. To learn how to play the game, you tried to kill Brandon. So by the time I left it in 2002, I was only there 5 years, the team had changed again. Christian had been fired, or not Christian, I'm sorry, American McGee had been let go. Brian walked out under his own power onto other jobs. John Cash left. Does anyone know what happened to John Cash? He's actually the super success story. He went on to be the technical director of World of Warcraft. I'm not certain where Barrett Alexander ended up, only that he left the company and was eventually replaced by Marty Stratton as biz guy number 2. Marty is still at the company. And then Brandon left for creative differences with Tim Willits, which I'm going to throw a little dirt out. Most of the designers who left during that time period left for creative differences with Tim Willits. And then eventually Paul Steed was fired. That was a bit of there was some drama there. It was all around the time that John Carmack decided that id would be doing Doom instead of Graham Devine's game Quest. Now I was scheduled to be the lead level designer on Quest, so I was very disappointed by this move. And it turns out so were the other 2 owners. And while John Carmack publicly went online and claimed that Paul Steed had been fired in retribution or retaliation for the changeover to Doom, the reality is that the 2 art leads in the company had been building up a list of things that were fireable offenses for Paul for quite some time. Something had happened at a recent E3, and that was the straw that broke the camel's back. So Paul was let go. So there's some disagreement in the official and history and the history as known by the people who were there at the time. So by the time the company, and now this is, we're talking 2018, the only people left there, Adrian went, John went, Christian followed John Carmack, and then Todd Hollins had eventually resigned, leaving only Kevin Cloud, Tim Willits, and Gustana still at the company after all these years. So, getting started, I'm going to play a video. I hope people won't mind. It's the opening video to Quake 2. It's actually one of my favorite parts of the whole game. So let's see if it plays. And did the audio get reconnected? It may not have. Let's see if this is it. No, maybe not. So this was audio that was in production. This was, if I remember, Paul Steed had done this audio, or this video. I'm very disappointed here.
I didn't introduce magic here. They had a signature yesterday.
Oh, okay. Is there anyone here who can do magic? All right, so the magicians have left for another theater. But this was the story, the opening story to Quake 2, and the background music was Rob Zombie, which was literally my only music in the game that I liked. It just wasn't my style of music. This was something I should have realized, but so I actually, when I did my levels, I actually had people choose the music for my game levels because it was all the same to me. But I like the Rob Zombie intro. Paul Steed did this video, which for me reminds me more of, it reminds me of Starship Troopers. It's this, in fact, the whole game reminds me of Star Trek Troopers, except that instead of fighting bugs, you're fighting zombies. So it's particularly here with the launch of the pods. Now the character you're following is a character they call Bitterman or Bitterman, and that was Kevin Steed's game handle. So Bitterman is actually Paul Steed, not Paul Steed, I'm sorry, Kevin Cloud. Boy, I'm not awake yet. It was Kevin Cloud's game handle. And Paul actually kind of hero worshipped. I think Paul kind of hero worshipped Kevin, because there was a lot of things in here that were tributes to him, and also in Quake 3 later on. So we were following it over kind of an overview of what in theory was our game world, and this big gun is this thing you're eventually supposed to knock out. And the whole theme behind Quake 2, it was a horror story with zombies. Techno-zombies. The enemies were mostly people who had been converted from being human. And you were to go through different levels, hub levels, and destroy the biggest, most expensive things you can find in each hub. That was the goal. And that big gun, which I think was represented in the background, sky background in one of the final levels, was your ultimate target. And so you fly down, and then all your team is just killed, and your mission is set up is to get through and try and reconnect with all the other Marines who may have survived the drop. And I really wish the sound was running. and black. So part of the whole process of the game was learning the tools. One of we learned a lot of things like some of the jargon, the things like potential viewable set, PVS, and binary space partition, and constructive solid geometry. These were all new to me at the time, but they were the building blocks of our game. And by modern techniques, they're fairly primitive. In fact, we had to be really careful using things like what was called CSG subtract, where you would hollow out an existing object with another object. You had to worry about creating leaks in the shell of the world you were created. So the idea was we were creating convex solid spaces surrounded by these shells. Everything was sealed in watertight. And if there was a leak, then your frame rate went went away, and you had to track down where there was a hole in your world. And the more complex your geometry, the harder it was to do. So we learned a lot of these fundamental checks of what were the Quake 2 engine at the time. And we were also in the process of it being developmental. So the engine, there was a moving target. One of the things we learned about was, this was a word I learned, was frustum. And that's your point of view. And it's controlled by how wide your camera angle is, and how much you can see in the game. And this was always the frustration, because you could only see 800 triangles in the game world at a time. That was one of the limits we worked under. I'll go into that in a little more detail. I talked about CSG subtract, or constructive solid geometry, being kind of primitive for us at the time, at least in the engine. I use it every day now, making stuff for 3D printing. This is just a scene from one of the projects I've got going in Tinkercad, which is a web program. And I don't have to worry about compiling it. I don't have to worry about whether or not I'm going to have holes in my geometry, and I can do really complex subtractions. So learning the tool, Quake Credit was one of our internal tool, and it was minimalist. Improvements were typically only to hook in new game features or entities, not game geometry. John Carmack was not a tools programmer. It wasn't something that really interested him. well, it was the understanding in the team that if we could have been forced to use a text editor to make the game, we would have been using a text editor. Because I understand some of the earlier games, Wolfenstein and Doom, could actually be edited in a text editor. And then there was learning the style. I think this is one of the most iconic early spaces in the game that people remember. It was a big open space, which was kind of unusual for Quake because you were really limited in geometry. But, so we embraced a style that I think would be called brutalism in the real world. And it's just basically large, blocky shapes, very low polygon. Say Quake 1 had been more about Gothic and medieval settings, so Quake 2 moved over into being it was all science fiction. The whole thing was a science fiction, hard tech, metal everywhere, maybe some concrete. But it was this, it came across the feeling of the Strogg. It was massive, it was cold, blocky, and overwhelming in scale. And the individual designers brought their own take on that. This is one of Tim Willitz's levels early on in the game. Mine tended to be, I did what was called the Palace level. If anyone remembers the Palace level near the end, closer to the end of the game, my spaces tend to be more winding and claustrophobic, more dungeon-like. Figure out that. We were working inside limitations constantly. The potential viewable set was what defined our designs. It was, you had to limit what you could see in the game at any given moment to 800 polygons, 800 triangles. If you saw more than that, you had two issues. One's the game slowed down, and in other cases, the engine stopped drawing part of the game. You just had things not draw. Now, this did not include the monsters, the weapons, the particle effects. You were always, those were on top of this. So this hard limit of 800 triangles was what we worked against, which would completely go away once 3D rendering came on board. But this was the last game we did it in that had that limitation. Quake 1 was even more limited. So you get an idea of why things were so severely blocky. Near the end of that development, I was talking earlier, we added color lighting. We had John, this is, I'll discuss on this is one of the things that happened. John rewrote the engine so that it would handle 3D acceleration. And at the end, the only real thing that we could change was to add colored lighting. At least from a design standpoint. And even for graphics, I mentioned, shared this earlier, that everyone didn't have a 3D accelerator card. We had to share them out, make our changes in our levels, and pass them on to the next designer who would do the same thing. Other limitations, and I'm certain people are aware of this, Quake used palletized color set. Those are all the colors that appeared in Quake 2.
Only 256 colors.
There were only 256 colors, and they were set up in such a way that when the dynamic lighting worked, it could slide the color in a pixel, the pointer at a pixel along the color value to make it darker or lighter. So you would get the appearance of these metals and these stones and everything shifting in light and dark as light traveled across it, say from a rocket or with the light maps it used. But it was really all just kind of faked in because it would just said, to make it darker, go to a pixel to the left. To make it lighter, go a pixel to the right. Or go a color choice to the light. We worked in a file format that was called PCX, which was the native output, like PSD is the file format for Photoshop. PCX was the file format for Paint Shop Pro, which was kind of the budget version of Photoshop available to us at the time. And this was after it had been using, what was the program? Deluxe Paint from Electronic Arts. They've been using that for quite some time. And it's unfortunate that Electronic Arts never went forward with that, because that was actually a fairly decent program. We did not use Photoshop, and the reason for that is that Photoshop flipped the two ends of the palette around. So you couldn't have, if you did art in Photoshop, the palette was flipped. So we didn't. And then our tool of necessity was PaintShop Pro, because Photoshop at the time wouldn't keep the palette intact. And Photoshop was also about 5 times more expensive. So even it was budget conscious. Hard to think of that time. The other limitations we worked with was the size of our graphics. Between Doom and Quake 2, the size of the pixels, or the texture pages, kept going up in size. Quake had used a 64 by 64 texture size for the artwork. With Quake 2, we pushed that 4 times larger, and now we had 128 by 128 textures. And Quake 3 would push that up to 256 by 256, and move us to more true color. We lost the color limitations, but all those colors, all those background art was done by Kevin Cloud and Adrian Carmack. And Adrian would just be cranking out variants. He'd come up with a design, and then he would crank out 20, 30, 40 variants of that color in different color shifts. So if you go through the game and you see color changes, a lot of the artwork is the same. We just changed the color in them. Well, we got a lot of variety in that way. And then, pardon? That is one of the doors from the palace level. That's actually 2 pieces of artwork. There's 2 textures there. And I can't remember if Adrian did this or an artist we had contracted from the outside did this. But the palace art was some of the most distinctive and different art from the rest of the game. We actually had a lot more color involved. So it was kind of fun, because those are the tiles I got to work with. And then the other limitation were the characters. I went from working at id to go to work to Ensemble Studios, and eventually the first projects I worked at Ensemble was Age of Empires 3. And that was a true 3D game, and the characters that we were using for these tiny real-time strategy units were more complex than most of the characters in Quake 2. And definitely more complex than the characters in Quake 1. So everything was done with these fairly simple models that didn't have a lot of triangles in them, and if you remember playing the game, as they moved, they distorted horribly. That was the limitations. One of the interesting things about Quake 2, and this is not something we did in-house, was that we shipped with 1 character model, and then for multiplayer later on, we shipped a second model, a female version of the player character. But we already had a community that was supplying interesting content through websites like Polycount. But they were mostly doing skins for the Quake guy. The way the characters were exported, the monsters and particularly the characters in Quake 2 were exported, they weren't skeleton-based models. They may have been animated with a skeleton in them, but they were basically triangle soup. You calculated every vertex on the model at every animation frame or at keyframes and moved between the keyframes. So this allowed people to come in and replace the Quake guy with some really incredible, beautiful model characters from comic books and cartoons and just about everything. I remember one of the most amazing models somebody had taken the mad scientist from the Christmas Halloween movie, Nightmare Before Christmas. They had taken the doctor, the evil doctor in the wheelchair from Nightmare Before Christmas, and done him as a Quake 2 character model. And his transformation animations were just, I mean, he would spin around, he would fly. There was just all these incredible animations. They were huge. They wouldn't have really worked well in game, but it was gorgeous. So these models were all limited, and they had a kind of a limit annotation. One of the other limitations that came on later was they had limited AI, and that's another story. My first maps were, I was learning how to do this job, so my first map that I built was actually a secret level. If you've played Quake 2 in the base, if you go, there's a pool there that if you go down in it, you can find, I think, a broken space along one wall. If you follow through that broken space, you go to a level called the Lost Station. That is my first ever 3D game level. And somehow I managed to try and push the envelope of what Quake 2 could do even then. There's a tram car in it that runs around on a track. Now, most people, when they did trams in some of the Quake 2 levels, they were all horizontal. They ran around, and a block or an object would connect it to an object that moved along a path. Well, I did that, but I did the path vertically. So it's kind of like riding a train car, not a train car, but a ski lift. You jump on this and ride it around through a tube, and you really weren't supposed to be able to do that in Quake because the model doesn't attach, the Quake 2 model doesn't attach to the moving object. So you're always jittering and bouncing around. And yet somehow it managed to work. And you could jump off the thing and die and find your way out through. But it was one of my first challenges, and true to form, I kind of had my mission while I was at ID. This was that I would always try to find ways to make the engine push the envelope. And in some cases it worked, like here, and in other cases it made too large a memory footprint, as in Quake 3. So you could actually follow this around, go down different areas. It was a couple more shots. But my next piece that I worked on was the palace levels, which was, you ended up, the outer courtyards, the lower palace and the upper palace, and you were going to find a bunch of little special keys that essentially you shut down a communication device. I had a different set of textures to work with than everyone else, and I kind of imposed my own design style. So my visuals are more along the lines of church Gothic rather than the straight up blockiness. And again, this got me into trouble in a bit, that it was making more complex volumes that often leaked. And my artwork tended to be, because of my put more visual complexity into the art, I ended up having areas that had to be more already, oh my, all more congested. Okay, so I'm going to run through this real quick, and then I lost track of time. So you can see some of the levels here from Palace. And then we would go down to a secret that was hidden in there. It was called the Ancient Head, which is John Carmack's head. And you could actually, unlike John Romero's head in Doom 2, you could actually take John Carmack's head with you. So this was this the ultimate secret in Quake 2? Or was it this picture of a young man and his precious treasure? I don't know if you can see that. That's John Carmack in front of his Ferrari. This was taken from a photo in a magazine. So some of the quick production stories. One of the big ones, and I'll just hit this, is that after E3 in 1997, John came back and decided that he had to move the game from Quake C to using DLLs. This meant 6 months before a contract had shipped for a AAA product, he completely rewrote the game engine. This meant that we had to play catch up with everything that was broken by it. And the biggest issue, and Adrian Carmack recently brought this up in an interview he did, was that we lost game AI. Because John Cash was the only other gameplay programmer, he ended up not being able to completely replace the game AI. We lost a variety in weapon attacks, things like that. Some of the grenades, specialties we had working on just went away. We couldn't do them anymore. Wasn't time. We used to test games in one of the outside rooms. If you've ever seen a picture of where id Software was located, it was a 7-story black glass building in Texas. And it used to get hot in the afternoon. And we tested our games in an outside office. And if you understand the difference where car sickness comes from, it's usually you're a passenger and you're not in control of the vehicle. Well, that was how doing game reviews on a Friday afternoon was like for me. Hot room, crowded with people, and you're watching people drive in front of you. I used to have to keep Pepto-Bismol in the desk in my office, and after review, I would go in my office and chug it. One of my favorite maps, and this was all about violating instructions. At the end of Quake 3, Quake 2, we were behind schedule. We were late on ship, but we already had travel plans, everyone. So at the end, it was John Cash was in the office, Brandon James was in the office, and I was in the office. And this was Thanksgiving weekend, and we were taking time away from our families who did not appreciate it that weekend. And we were triaging bugs as they came in and fixing the ones that were showstoppers. And Tim Willits had left the office. He was in Australia with Paul Steed on a promotional tour. And he left us with the instructions, don't recompile the maps. Because recompiling, when you compile the map, you always had a risk of introducing errors. Always. They were fragile things. But all the bugs we were getting in were map bugs. So between Brandon and I, we reopened almost every level and all of American McGee's levels to go in and fix things that had either been left unfinished or were broken, including, if you love co-op, all the co-op starts in a lot of Americans' levels were just gone. In fact, we even missed a few, and John Cash had to go back in and add them programmatically. So, as opposed to building it in the game. So that weekend, John, Brandon, and I shipped Quake 3. Or excuse me, Quake 2, and got it ready to go to market about a week later. And some of the aftershocks, we didn't ship with Deathmatch. Deathmatch came later. People may not remember that. I even have to remind myself that when we shipped the game, it was single player only. I did not do any of the Deathmatch maps. We didn't ship with one of the most popular mods, which is Capture the Flag. Dave Zoid Kirsch was an outside contractor who brought his Capture the Flag rules from Quake 1 to work on Quake 2. And he and his team did most of the maps, or at least most of the first maps. My first Deathmatch map was City 64, which we did these 3 giant 64-player maps out of our level bits. If anyone remembers Polycount, it came out from this time period, and I actually coined the tagline for it, which was a constant costume party. And then Rogue Entertainment and Zatrix went on to, or Gray Matter went on to make the two level packs for the game. So what happened next? I'm just going to go after this. We were actually making a game pack out for Quake 2, and we decided somewhere along the line we just weren't into it. And John came forward with this idea for Quake 3 that only would work on Accelerator, and we bandwagoned on that. It was risky, but it was a risk worth taking. And so we produced a multiplayer game that required game or acceleration, 3D acceleration. So I'm almost done here. If you want to know more about the story of what happened to id Software, there's a couple of books I'll recommend. One is Masters of Doom. It's a nice story. It's a story of competition. It's almost Pirates of Silicon Valley, but it's John versus John, the story of how they, their competition and how that played out over the life of id Software. I know John Romero's a friend, but I've never worked with him. And then Rocket Jump, which was done recently by David Craddock. And this is the one with dirt in it. This is the best way I can put it, because he's got a lot of interviews with former id people about how they feel about what went on at the company. It deals with a lot. It's called Rocket Jump, the golden age of first-person shooters. So it's more than just id, but it's got a lot of id stories in it, and it's got a lot of former id people talking about their experiences there. And then, by 2002, I was ready for other challenges, and id was ready to have me find other challenges, as they had done with most designers before me. And it was a good place. It was a good place to work for my experience. Really helped my career, but it was a lot of stress, and it caused a lot of work-life balance, and eventually a failed marriage. So, any questions? I think we're almost out of time, but I'll take a couple questions. Yes?
Yeah, you said you rewrote it in the last 6 months. Can you talk anything about what the main reasons for that were?
I'm really not certain, but it was a modernization of the program. A programmer, it didn't affect anything. It didn't affect our design in any way. We didn't, because we still had to be in software. But I think it made it possible. It may have made it possible for the light, for the 3D acceleration, and it also modernized the code for the way the other games were being developed at the time. In the light.
Yes, I have a question. The way Quake 2, it's been very, tech-led. Was there any discussions, like in the pre-production stages of Quake 2, where you guys would continue on doing the little people with comic fans type stuff?
If there were, I wasn't there then. I came in March of '97, and a good share of the game was. Paul Steed was already doing the intro movie when I got there, so the whole storyline had already been established by that point. As I understood it, they had explored a number of different areas, and Quake 2, they decided to go with just the tech.
I hate to do this, but it is 5 past.
Oh, okay.
We need to wrap up.
All right. Yes, one question, and then I'm going to take it out in the hallway.
You attributed Todd with the Holland's contribution to the company as.
I think he made Quake id successful.
What did he do?
He's business. He was the guy who came in and negotiated the deals with Activision. Basically moved id from kind of a really successful indie company into being a power brand that was desirable by other companies. And Activision did really nice for us. It was it was nice working with Activision. Okay, we're done.